3 fleets, 3 civilizations, 3,000 years of galactic supremacy reduced to silence in the void around a single blue world. Admiral Kethvar stared at the holographic display showing the empty coordinates where the hegemony's 4th Expeditionary Force should have been broadcasting victory signals. Instead, nothing but cosmic background radiation whispered through space where 12,000 warships had vanished without a trace. The pattern was undeniable now. The Vrex Empire's first contact fleet gone, the Stellar Confederation's subjugation armada erased, the Dominion's pacification force obliterated. Each fleet more advanced than the last, each carrying the accumulated military wisdom of species that had conquered hundreds of worlds, each meeting the same inexplicable fate in the gravitational shadow of the 3rd planet from an unremarkable yellow star. "Sir, incoming priority transmission from Fleet Command," Communications Officer Nethrol announced, her crystalline voice carrying an undertone of dread that had become commonplace in recent cycles. The holographic seal of the Galactic Military Consortium materialized above the command deck, its rotating insignia casting eerie shadows across the assembled officers. "Admiral Kethvar, you are to proceed immediately to the Terran system for investigation and, if necessary, pacification." The message began with typical bureaucratic efficiency. "Previous expeditions have suffered communication failures. Intelligence suggests primitive civilization incapable of significant resistance. Standard conquest protocols authorized." Communication failures. The euphemism would have been amusing if not for the mounting evidence that something far more sinister was occurring in that distant system. Kethvar had studied the classified reports, what little remained of them. Each expedition had sent back identical preliminary data: crude chemical propulsion, primitive electromagnetic communications, a fractured political structure that should have collapsed at the first sign of superior force. Yet here stood the consortium's most decorated admiral, preparing to lead the 5th attempt at what should have been a routine planetary acquisition. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were sending their best to deal with what every intelligence assessment classified as their least significant threat. "Helm, set course for the Sol system," Kethvar commanded, using the indigenous name for the target star. "Maximum velocity. And patch me through to Intelligence Division. I want every scrap of data they have on this terror." The journey through hyperspace gave him time to review the files, each more puzzling than the last. The planet showed clear signs of industrial civilization, massive energy signatures, orbital debris consistent with space programs, atmospheric composition indicating widespread technological activity. Yet the visible infrastructure suggested a species barely past their own gravitational well, certainly incapable of challenging forces that had subjugated entire star systems. Senior intelligence analyst Xor-Ath materialized on the command deck via quantum entanglement projector, her form shimmering with the distinctive blue shift of long-distance communication. "Admiral, I've compiled everything we know about the target species. The data is inconsistent." "Define inconsistent," Kethvar replied, studying the preliminary scans that showed a world divided into numerous political entities, their boundaries shifting constantly in what appeared to be chronic territorial disputes. They called themselves humans, bipedal, carbon-based, roughly analogous to standard galactic physiology. Intelligence estimates suggest they've achieved atomic manipulation, basic rocketry, and planetary communication networks. Their largest political structures encompass perhaps 20% of the planetary surface. By all conventional metrics, they should have surrendered to the first fleet that demonstrated superior technology. Kethvar frowned at the tactical displays, showing primitive spacecraft barely capable of reaching their own satellite. "Then explain why 4 separate expeditions have failed to make contact." "That's where the data becomes problematic, sir. Each previous fleet reported initial observations consistent with our current intelligence. Fragmented leadership, limited technological capability, no evidence of unified planetary defense. Then communication ceased. The Admiral studied the energy readings more carefully. Something nagged at him about the patterns, too regular, too efficiently distributed for a civilization that supposedly struggled to maintain coherent governments. What about their military capabilities? Surface analysis indicates conventional chemical explosive weaponry, primitive aircraft, naval vessels dependent on surface transportation, nothing that should pose a threat to shielded vessels operating from orbit. Zorath paused, her form flickering with what might have been uncertainty. However, there are anomalies in the spectral analysis. What kind of anomalies? Energy signatures that don't match their apparent technological level. Deep space observation posts have detected electromagnetic patterns suggesting more sophisticated electronics than their visible infrastructure would require. And there's something else. Their communication networks show unusual redundancy patterns. Kethvar felt the first stirring of unease. In his experience, apparent primitives who displayed unexpected sophistication were usually hiding something significant. Elaborate. Their global communication system isn't just advanced, Admiral, it's militaristically robust. Multiple overlapping networks hardened against electromagnetic interference, with backup systems that suggest they've planned for coordinated planetary defense. This level of redundancy typically indicates a species that has prepared for large-scale conflict. The implications were troubling. Kethvar had conquered 17 worlds during his career, and he recognized the signs of a civilization that had learned to expect attack. Yet the humans showed no evidence of spacefaring capability that would justify such paranoia, unless they knew something about galactic politics that they shouldn't. Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the human homeworld, Nethril announced, her tone suggesting she found the development as surprising as everyone else. It's directed specifically at our fleet, using proper consortium identification protocols. The command deck fell silent. No primitive civilization should have known how to contact a consortium fleet, much less identify it using classified communication procedures. Kethvar felt his certainty beginning to erode. Put it through. The holographic display resolved into the image of a human, middle-aged by the species' apparent physiology, wearing what looked like formal attire appropriate for diplomatic contact. When the being spoke, it was in perfect consortium standard, with pronunciation that suggested extensive linguistic training. Greetings, Admiral Kethvar of the Consortium 5th Fleet. I am Director Nathaniel Ashworth of the Terran Defense Coordination Office. We've been expecting you. The words hit the command deck like a kinetic impactor. Kethvar felt his tactical training reassert itself, even as his mind struggled to process the implications. No species made first contact by demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't possess, unless it wasn't first contact at all. How do you know our designations? He demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers. Admiral, we've been monitoring galactic civilization for quite some time. We know about the Vrex, the Confederation, the Dominion, and your own consortium. We know why you're here, and we know what happened to your predecessors. Ashworth's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but there was something in his manner that suggested he was enjoying the conversation far more than circumstances warranted. Impossible. Your species lacks faster-than-light capability. You have no presence beyond your own solar system. That's correct, Admiral. We don't travel to other systems. We've found it more efficient to let other systems come to us. The statement carried implications that made Kethvar's tactical computers flag multiple threat assessment protocols. A species that deliberately remained within their home system while monitoring galactic civilization suggested either remarkable restraint or remarkable confidence. Neither quality was consistent with the intelligence profile suggesting primitive fragmentation. Director Ashworth, are you speaking for your entire species? I'm speaking for the portions of humanity that deal with extraterrestrial affairs. The rest of our population remains focused on internal development, as I'm sure your intelligence reports indicate." There was something almost condescending in the human's tone, as if he were explaining something obvious to a child. Kethvar had commanded fleets against species that had mastered technologies beyond consortium understanding, yet none had ever made him feel quite so thoroughly outmaneuvered during a first conversation. "What happened to our previous expeditions?" "They made the same assumptions you're currently making, Admiral. They saw what they expected to see rather than what was actually present. The Vreks, in particular, were quite insistent about the superiority of their combat doctrines." Ashworth paused, consulting what appeared to be a data tablet. Their fleet commander spent approximately 14 hours broadcasting demands for surrender before beginning offensive operations. We found his confidence rather touching. "And, Admiral, would you like to see what happened to the Vreks expedition?" Before Kethvar could respond, new data began flooding the fleet's sensors. Deep space scanning arrays detected massive debris fields in the outer system, twisted metal, and exotic alloys consistent with Vreks military engineering. The scale of destruction was staggering, suggesting not just the defeat of a fleet, but its complete obliteration. How did a pre-spaceflight civilization destroy vessels equipped with quantum shielding and temporal displacement drives? "We didn't destroy them, Admiral. We simply encouraged them to destroy themselves." Tad, the words carried a casual confidence that made every tactical officer on the command deck recalculate their threat assessments. Kethvar had seen civilizations that could overwhelm superior technology through numerical superiority, others that could outmaneuver advanced fleets through superior strategy. He had never encountered a species that claimed to manipulate their enemies into self-destruction. Elaborate, the Vreks' approach to conquest relies on demonstrating overwhelming superiority to encourage psychological surrender. They broadcast intimidation messages, display their weapons capabilities, and generally attempt to terrify their opponents into submission before commencing actual hostilities. It's an efficient doctrine when facing species that share their basic assumptions about warfare. Kethvar found himself nodding. The Vreks' methodology was legendary throughout the galaxy. Swift, brutal demonstrations of superior force that typically ended conflicts before they began. It had proven effective against hundreds of worlds across multiple star systems. However, Ashworth continued, their doctrine assumes their opponents will respond to demonstrations of superior technology with recognition of their own inferiority. Humans don't share that assumption. What assumption do humans make? That any technology demonstrated by an enemy is technology that can be analyzed, understood, and countered. The Vreks spent considerable time showing us exactly how their weapon systems, defensive capabilities, and tactical doctrines functioned. We found their educational presentations extremely helpful. The implications were staggering. Kethvar had reviewed thousands of conquest scenarios, but he had never encountered a species that treated enemy intimidation displays as technical demonstrations. The concept suggested a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that treated every enemy action as an opportunity for intelligence gathering rather than a reason for despair. You reverse-engineered Vreks technology from their intimidation broadcasts? We reverse-engineered their tactical psychology, Admiral. Their technology was impressive, but their predictability was their true weakness. Once we understood how they approached combat, encouraging their self-destruction became relatively straightforward. And the other expeditions? Each species has distinctive approaches to conquest, Admiral. The Confederation preferred psychological warfare, broadcasting propaganda about the futility of resistance while demonstrating their historical victories over other worlds. They were quite thorough in providing us with detailed tactical analyses of their previous campaigns. Kethvar felt his confidence continuing to erode. Standard conquest doctrine called for demonstrating superior capability to encourage surrender, But these humans seem to treat such demonstrations as intelligence briefings. What did you learn from the Confederation? That their psychological warfare techniques were highly effective against species that shared their cultural assumptions about hierarchical authority and the inevitability of defeat. Unfortunately for them, human psychology doesn't recognize inevitability as a meaningful concept. Explain. Admiral, the Confederation broadcast detailed recordings of their victories over 17 different worlds, explaining precisely how each civilization's resistance had proven futile. They intended to demonstrate that opposition was pointless. Ashworth's expression showed what might have been amusement. Instead, they provided us with comprehensive tactical analyses of 17 different defensive strategies, along with detailed explanations of why each approach had failed. The concept was breathtaking in its implications. Every military force in the galaxy used historical victories as psychological weapons, demonstrating the futility of resistance by showing how other species had been defeated. The humans apparently treated such demonstrations as educational opportunities, learning from the failures of other worlds to develop more effective defensive strategies. And the Dominion. The Dominion's approach was more sophisticated. They attempted to co-opt our leadership structures by offering positions within their hierarchy to humans who demonstrated appropriate compliance. They began by broadcasting detailed analyses of our political systems, explaining which leaders they intended to preserve and which they considered expendable. Kethvar knew the Dominion methodology: divide and conquer through selective preservation of existing authority structures. It was highly effective against species with centralized leadership, as local authorities often chose collaboration over obliteration. That should have fragmented your resistance. It would have, if our leadership structures were actually what they appeared to be. The Dominion spent considerable time analyzing our visible political organizations, governments, military hierarchies, economic systems. They developed detailed plans for co-opting what they identified as our decision-making apparatus. But our actual decision-making apparatus isn't visible to external observation, Admiral. The structures the Dominion analyzed exist primarily to interact with other humans. When dealing with extraterrestrial threats, we employ different organizational systems entirely. The statement suggested layers of deception that made Kethvar's strategic training flag multiple contingency protocols. A species that maintained separate organizational structures for internal and external affairs demonstrated a level of institutional paranoia that usually indicated extensive experience with sophisticated enemies. Yet humans had supposedly never encountered other spacefaring civilizations before. How long have you been preparing for galactic contact? Approximately 73 Earth years by your measurement systems. We detected the first VREX deep space reconnaissance probes in what you would classify as 1952 of our local calendar. 73 years. The timeline suggested that humans had been aware of galactic civilization for nearly 3 human generations, while successfully concealing that knowledge from 4 separate intelligence operations. The level of sustained deception required indicated institutional capabilities that contradicted every assessment of human organizational competence. Your civilization has been maintaining a planetary conspiracy for over 7 decades. Admiral, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about human civilization. You've analyzed our visible political structures and concluded that we're a fragmented species, incapable of coordinated action. That analysis is correct as far as it goes. But fragmentation and coordination aren't mutually exclusive concepts for humans. We can maintain hundreds of competing political systems while simultaneously operating unified strategic initiatives. It's rather like asking whether a human body is a single organism or a collection of separate organs. The question reflects assumptions that don't apply to our organizational methodology. The concept challenged basic assumptions about political organization that underlay all consortium strategic doctrine. Every known species organized either hierarchically, with centralized authority structures, or anarchically, with no meaningful coordination above the local level. Humans apparently operated according to principles that allowed both simultaneously. Director Ashworth, you're claiming that your species maintains planetary unity for external affairs while preserving internal diversity for domestic issues. That's a reasonable approximation, Admiral. When dealing with other humans, we operate as several hundred independent political entities with frequently conflicting interests. When dealing with extraterrestrial affairs, those same political entities function as components of a unified strategic system. Impossible. No species can maintain that level of organizational complexity without fragmenting. Admiral, has your intelligence analysis considered the possibility that human political fragmentation might be deliberately maintained rather than accidentally sustained? The question struck at the heart of consortium assumptions about political development. Advanced civilizations were supposed to progress toward greater unity and efficiency, eliminating the wasteful conflicts that characterized primitive societies. Yet Ashworth was suggesting that humans had chosen to preserve political fragmentation as a strategic asset. Elaborate. Fragmented political systems are extremely difficult for external forces to co-opt or control, Admiral. A species with a single government presents a single point of failure. Eliminate or corrupt the central authority, and the entire civilization becomes manageable. But a species with dozens of competing governments presents dozens of separate systems that must be individually compromised. That assumes your competing governments would resist external influence equally. It assumes that at least some of them will, Admiral, which is sufficient for our purposes. External forces attempting to control human civilization would need to simultaneously compromise several hundred independent political entities, each operating according to different cultural assumptions and strategic priorities. The complexity scales exponentially rather than linearly. Kethavar found himself reconsidering everything he thought he understood about human organization. What appeared to be chaotic inefficiency might actually represent a deliberately maintained defensive strategy. Political diversity as a form of institutional immune system. And your military capabilities are distributed among those same political entities, Admiral. Each maintains independent armed forces, intelligence services, and strategic doctrines. An enemy attempting to neutralize human military capability would need to simultaneously defeat dozens of separate military organizations, each operating according to different tactical philosophies. That should make coordinated defense impossible. For internal conflicts, yes. For external threats, coordination emerges naturally without requiring centralized command structures. It's rather like an immune system, Admiral. Individual components respond to threats according to local conditions while contributing to overall defensive effectiveness. The biological metaphor was apt and deeply troubling. Kethavar had conquered civilizations with sophisticated military technology, advanced strategic thinking, and extensive combat experience. But he had never faced an enemy that operated like a distributed organism, with multiple independent systems contributing to unified defensive objectives. Director Ashworth, what exactly happened to our previous expeditions? Each expedition applied standard conquest methodologies that assume their opponents operate according to conventional political and military principles. When those methodologies failed to produce expected results, they escalated force levels until they triggered defensive responses that exceeded their ability to manage. Meaning they kept increasing pressure until they discovered exactly how much force humanity was capable of deploying in response to existential threats. Unfortunately for them, that threshold proved to be considerably higher than their own force projection capabilities. The casual tone with which Ashworth discussed the destruction of entire fleets was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the conversation. He spoke of eliminating thousands of warships and millions of personnel with the detached professionalism of someone discussing weather patterns. What force levels are you capable of deploying? Admiral, that's rather like asking how many white blood cells a human body contains. The answer depends on the severity of the infection. Provide an estimate. Oh, based on previous encounters, Admiral, I would suggest that any force level sufficient to threaten human civilization would automatically trigger responses that exceed that force level by a significant margin. That's not an answer. With respect, Admiral, it's the only answer that matters. Your predecessors learned that escalation against humanity doesn't follow conventional strategic mathematics. Each increase in applied force produces a disproportionate increase in defensive response until the attacking force reaches its operational limits, while human defensive capabilities are still expanding. Kethvar studied the tactical displays showing his fleet's position relative to the human homeworld. 5,000 vessels, each equipped with weapons capable of sterilizing planetary surfaces. By any conventional measure, it represented overwhelming superiority against a pre-spaceflight civilization. Yet 4 previous expeditions with comparable capabilities had vanished completely. Director Ashworth, are you threatening the Consortium Fifth Fleet? Admiral, I'm providing you with information that might help you avoid the mistakes made by your predecessors. Whether you interpret that as a threat or as an opportunity depends on your strategic flexibility. What kind of opportunity? The opportunity to be the first galactic expedition to return home with accurate intelligence about human civilization, rather than simply disappearing like the others. The offer was tempting, but Kethvar had not achieved his position by accepting enemy terms without understanding their implications. What would such intelligence cost? Nothing more than the acknowledgement that humanity prefers to be left alone, Admiral. We have no interest in expanding beyond our home system, no desire for galactic conquest, and no intention of interfering with consortium activities elsewhere. Then why destroy our expeditions instead of simply communicating your desire for isolation? Because your expeditions didn't come here for diplomatic contact, Admiral. They came here for conquest. The Vrex, the Confederation, and the Dominion all made their intentions quite clear before beginning hostilities. We responded appropriately. And if we were to withdraw without attempting conquest, then you would return to consortium space with detailed intelligence about a previously unknown defensive methodology, along with our assurance that humanity poses no threat to galactic civilization, provided galactic civilization poses no threat to humanity. The proposal was tempting, but it raised as many questions as it answered. A species capable of destroying 4 separate invasion fleets while claiming no interest in expansion suggested either remarkable restraint or remarkable confidence. Both qualities made Kethvar profoundly nervous. Director Ashworth, why should we trust assurances from a species that has concealed its true capabilities from galactic intelligence for over 7 decades? Because, Admiral, a species that has successfully concealed its capabilities for 7 decades while eliminating 4 invasion fleets clearly doesn't require your trust to maintain its security. We're offering cooperation because we prefer it to conflict, not because we need it for survival. The logic was unassailable, which made it even more disturbing. Kethvar had commanded fleets against enemies who begged for mercy and enemies who fought to the last vessel. He had never faced an enemy who offered reasonable terms from a position of demonstrated superiority while claiming no interest in conquest. What guarantee do we have that humanity won't change its isolationist policy? The same guarantee you have that any spacefaring species won't change its expansion policy, Admiral. None whatsoever. However, consider the strategic implications. A species that has remained within its home system while developing capabilities sufficient to eliminate galactic invasion fleets has demonstrated both the ability and the inclination to maintain defensive rather than offensive strategic objectives. That could change. Of course it could, Admiral. But if it does change, you'll have advance warning based on observable modifications to human activity patterns. A species preparing for interstellar expansion would necessarily begin developing the infrastructure required for sustained operations outside its home system. Such preparations would be impossible to conceal from galactic intelligence. Assuming your current isolation is genuine rather than strategic deception. Admiral, if human isolation were strategic deception designed to facilitate eventual expansion, we would have begun that expansion after eliminating our first invasion fleet, rather than waiting for additional expeditions to provide us with more comprehensive intelligence about galactic military capabilities. The point was uncomfortably valid. A species practicing strategic deception would have used its initial victories to launch immediate expansion rather than continuing to defend its home system against increasingly sophisticated attacks. The humans' consistent focus on defense suggested genuine isolationist objectives. Director Ashworth, what specific intelligence are you prepared to share about human defensive capabilities? Sufficient detail to allow the consortium to understand why conventional conquest methodologies proved ineffective, Admiral. Your strategists will find the analysis quite educational. And in exchange, you return to consortium space with accurate intelligence rather than joining your predecessors in permanent silence. The offer was straightforward, but Kethavar had seen too many apparently simple negotiations conceal devastating complications. What assurance do I have that you won't simply add our fleet to your collection of defeated expeditions after we've gathered your intelligence? Admiral, if we intended to eliminate your fleet, this conversation would be unnecessary. We've demonstrated our capability to destroy invasion forces. We've now demonstrated our willingness to offer alternatives to destruction. Whether you accept those alternatives depends on your assessment of the relative risks. Meaning you can attempt to repeat the strategies that failed your predecessors, or you can return home with information that might prevent future expeditions from making the same mistakes. Kethavar found himself facing a strategic decision unlike any in his career. Standard military doctrine called for either decisive victory or tactical withdrawal, but the humans were offering a third option: educational defeat. They were willing to reveal their defensive methodologies in exchange for an end to invasion attempts. Director Ashworth, you're proposing to teach consortium strategists how to recognize and avoid civilizations with capabilities similar to your own. Precisely, Admiral. We're offering to share intelligence that will help galactic civilization identify defensive systems capable of repelling invasion fleets before those fleets commit to attack. Why? Because preventing futile invasions serves everyone's interests, Admiral. We prefer not to eliminate galactic expeditions, and galactic civilizations, presumably, prefer not to lose them. The reasoning was sound, but it suggested a level of strategic sophistication that made Kethavar increasingly uncomfortable. The humans were treating galactic invasion attempts as an educational problem rather than an existential threat, offering to help their potential enemies avoid strategies that wouldn't succeed. You're confident that sharing this intelligence won't enable the development of countermeasures? Admiral, the intelligence we're offering concerns strategic principles rather than specific technologies. Understanding why certain approaches fail doesn't automatically provide the capability to make them succeed. Elaborate. Consider the Vrex expedition, Admiral. They failed because they assumed that demonstrating superior technology would produce psychological surrender. Understanding that assumption doesn't enable other species to develop technology capable of intimidating humans into submission. but it might enable them to develop alternative approaches. Of course, Admiral. That's rather the point. We're encouraging the development of alternatives to invasion as a method of interspecies contact. The conversation had evolved beyond anything in Kethvar's experience. He was discussing military intelligence with an enemy who seemed genuinely interested in reducing future conflict through strategic education. It violated every principle of conventional warfare he had ever learned. Director Ashworth, this intelligence exchange would require direct access to human defensive installations and strategic planning systems. Naturally, Admiral, meaningful intelligence cannot be gathered from theoretical discussions. You would need to observe our defensive methodologies in operation to understand their effectiveness. That level of access would provide comprehensive intelligence about your capabilities. Yes, Admiral, that's what makes it meaningful intelligence. And you're willing to provide that access to representatives of a galactic civilization that has repeatedly attempted to conquer your world? We're willing to provide that access to representatives who demonstrate genuine interest in understanding rather than conquering, Admiral. Your willingness to engage in this conversation suggests that your strategic priorities might be more flexible than those of your predecessors. Kethvar realized he had reached the crucial decision point. He could order his fleet to begin standard conquest operations, likely joining the previous expeditions in Oblivion. Or he could accept an unprecedented offer of intelligence cooperation from a species that had demonstrated remarkable defensive capabilities. Director Ashworth, I need to consult with my senior staff before proceeding. Of course, Admiral. However, I should mention that our defensive systems have been activated since your arrival in this system. Any decision to initiate hostilities would trigger immediate response. Are you threatening us? I'm informing you of our current operational status, Admiral. Threat assessment is your responsibility. The distinction was subtle, but significant. The humans weren't threatening attack. They were stating their readiness to defend themselves. The difference suggested confidence rather than aggression. How long do we have to decide? As long as you need, Admiral, provided you remain in non-threatening positions and configurations. Our defensive systems will remain activated, but non-aggressive, as long as your fleet maintains current status. And if we choose to withdraw, without accepting your intelligence offer, then you withdraw, Admiral. We have no interest in preventing departure by non-aggressive forces. But we wouldn't receive the intelligence. Naturally. The intelligence is contingent upon cooperative engagement. Withdrawal would constitute non-cooperative disengagement. Kethvar terminated the communication and turned to his senior staff. Every officer on the command deck was staring at displays that showed no change in the tactical situation, yet somehow everything had changed. They were facing an enemy who offered education instead of demanding surrender. Tactical assessment, he ordered. Admiral, our sensors show no evidence of human military assets capable of threatening fleet operations, Commander Wexler reported. However, given the fate of previous expeditions, we must assume the presence of capabilities beyond our detection threshold. Strategic assessment. The human offer appears genuine, Admiral, Intelligence Officer Kelthos observed. They've demonstrated both the capability to eliminate invasion fleets and the restraint to offer alternatives to conflict. Their proposal provides intelligence value while minimizing operational risks of accepting their offer. Potential exposure of consortium military capabilities to hostile intelligence gathering. However, previous expeditions have already provided them with extensive examples of our military technology and tactics. Additional exposure might be minimal. Benefits. Comprehensive intelligence about defensive methodologies that have proven effective against 4 separate galactic civilizations. Such intelligence could prevent future expedition losses while providing strategic insight into previously unknown defensive principles. Kethvar studied the tactical displays one more time. His fleet represented the accumulated military power of one of the galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations. Yet he was seriously considering accepting educational cooperation from a species that supposedly lacked the capability to leave its own solar system. Open a channel to Director Ashworth. The human reappeared on the holographic display, his expression suggesting he had expected the call. Admiral, have you reached a decision? We accept your offer, Director Ashworth. We're prepared to engage in intelligence cooperation regarding human defensive capabilities. Excellent, Admiral. We'll begin with historical analysis of previous expeditions, then proceed to direct observation of current defensive systems. I think you'll find the experience quite educational. Where do we begin? With the Virex debris field, Admiral. Understanding what happened to your predecessors is essential context for understanding our current capabilities. Then, over the following days, Kethvar's fleet received a comprehensive education in asymmetric warfare that challenged every assumption about military science he had ever held. The humans hadn't simply destroyed 4 invasion fleets. They had systematically deconstructed each expedition's strategic assumptions and turned them into tactical vulnerabilities. The Vrex had been destroyed by their own weapons, convinced to demonstrate their capabilities until human analysis identified critical design flaws that could be exploited remotely. The Confederation had been eliminated by psychological warfare tactics based on their own propaganda broadcasts, which had revealed their cultural assumptions and strategic methodologies. The Dominion had been defeated by their own co-optation strategies, as humans fed them false intelligence about human leadership structures that led them into tactical positions where their advanced technology became a liability. Each expedition had been destroyed, not by superior human technology, but by superior human understanding of their enemy's strategic psychology. The humans had analyzed each invasion force's assumptions about warfare and civilization, then created conditions where those assumptions led to self-destruction. Admiral, you're observing the fundamental principle of human defensive strategy, Director Ashworth explained during a tour of Earth's planetary defense installations. We don't defeat our enemies' capabilities, we defeat their strategic assumptions. Elaborate. Every species develops military doctrine based on their experiences with conflict. Those doctrines embody assumptions about how warfare functions, how enemies will respond to various stimuli, and what constitutes victory or defeat. Human defensive strategy focuses on identifying those assumptions and creating conditions where they produce counterproductive results. The installations themselves were remarkable not for their advanced technology, though much of it exceeded consortium capabilities, but for their integration with seemingly civilian infrastructure. Every communication satellite, every power grid, every transportation network was designed to function as a component of planetary defense while maintaining its civilian applications. This level of integration requires decades of coordinated planning, Kethvar observed. 73 years of coordinated planning, Admiral. We've been preparing for galactic contact since we first detected evidence of your civilizations. Why didn't you attempt diplomatic contact instead of waiting for invasion? Because invasion tells us more about galactic civilization than diplomacy would, Admiral. Diplomatic contact reveals what species want us to know about them. Invasion attempts reveal what they actually believe about us. The logic was ruthless, but undeniable. By allowing themselves to be attacked, the humans had gained comprehensive intelligence about galactic military capabilities, strategic methodologies, and political assumptions. Each invasion attempt had provided them with detailed information about how galactic civilizations approached conquest. Director Ashworth, how many species have attempted invasion? 4 major expeditions, Admiral, plus 17 reconnaissance missions over the past 7 decades. Each provided valuable intelligence about galactic civilizations' military capabilities and strategic assumptions. And you've eliminated all of them? We've eliminated the expeditions that came here with conquest objectives, Admiral. Several reconnaissance missions returned to their home systems with reports that led to the invasion attempts. Meaning you deliberately allowed some scouts to return home. Meaning we provided some scouts with intelligence calculated to produce invasion attempts, Admiral. We needed comprehensive data about galactic military capabilities, which required encouraging attacks by progressively more sophisticated forces. The revelation was staggering. Kethavar realized he was looking at a species that had manipulated galactic intelligence for 7 decades, encouraging invasion attempts in order to study their enemies' capabilities while concealing their own defensive preparations. You've been using our expeditions as intelligence-gathering exercises. We've been using your expeditions as educational opportunities, Admiral. Each attack provided us with detailed information about galactic military science, strategic doctrine, and technological capabilities. By the time your fleet arrived, we had comprehensive intelligence about 4 separate galactic civilizations' approaches to conquest. And now you're sharing that intelligence with us. We're sharing the strategic principles we've derived from that intelligence, Admiral. Understanding why your predecessors failed should help prevent future expeditions from making similar mistakes. The final revelation came during a demonstration of Earth's planetary defense grid. What Kethavar had initially assumed to be a collection of individual defensive installations was actually a single integrated system spanning the entire planet. Every military base, communication center, and industrial facility was connected through quantum-entangled networks that enabled instantaneous coordination across global distances. Admiral, you're looking at a planetary defense system that has been under continuous development for 7 decades, Ashworth explained, as displays showed the interconnected network spanning continents and oceans. Every component is designed to function independently while contributing to overall defensive effectiveness. This represents a massive resource commitment. It represents our entire civilization's response to the discovery that we're not alone in the galaxy, Admiral. Every human institution, every technological development, every strategic initiative has been influenced by our awareness of galactic civilization. Your entire species has been preparing for invasion for 7 decades. Our entire species has been preparing for contact with galactic civilization for 7 decades, Admiral. Invasion preparation was simply one component of that broader readiness initiative. Kethavar found himself looking at a civilization that had fundamentally reorganized itself around the expectation of eventual conflict with technologically superior enemies. Every aspect of human development had been influenced by strategic considerations that most species didn't encounter until after achieving interstellar travel. Director Ashworth, what happens now? Now you return to consortium space with intelligence that should prevent future invasion attempts, Admiral, and humanity continues its development in isolation, secure in the knowledge that galactic civilization understands the futility of conquest attempts. And if the consortium decides that human capabilities represent a threat requiring preemptive action, then the consortium will discover that preemptive action against a prepared enemy produces even less favorable results than reactive conquest attempts, Admiral. We've been preparing for that possibility as well. The warning was delivered with the same casual confidence that had characterized the entire conversation. Kethavar realized he was dealing with a species that had anticipated every possible galactic response to their defensive capabilities and prepared accordingly. Director Ashworth, may I ask one final question? Of course, Admiral. How many other species in the galaxy have defensive capabilities comparable to humanity's? Based on our analysis of galactic civilization, Admiral, we estimate the number at 0. The statement hung in the air between them like a death sentence for every strategic assumption the galaxy had ever made about planetary conquest. Kethavar felt the weight of implications that stretched far beyond his current mission, beyond even the consortium's immediate strategic concerns. You're saying humanity represents a completely unique defensive paradigm. We're saying that every other spacefaring species we've encountered has developed military doctrine optimized for expansion and conquest, Admiral. Defensive thinking, when it exists at all, focuses on protecting existing territorial holdings rather than preventing initial conquest attempts. No other species has organized their entire civilization around the assumption that technologically superior enemies will eventually attempt invasion. Because no other species remained planet-bound long enough to develop such preparations. Precisely, Admiral. Spacefaring civilizations focus their defensive resources on protecting their expanded territories and supply lines. Planet-bound civilizations typically lack the technological base required for effective defense against space-based attack. Humanity exists in the narrow intersection between those categories, technologically capable of effective defense while geographically concentrated enough to make comprehensive preparation feasible. HFY studied the displays showing Earth's integrated defense networks and realized he was looking at something that could never be replicated by a multi-system civilization. The level of coordination and resource concentration required would be impossible to maintain across interstellar distances. How long do you estimate before other species develop comparable capabilities? Admiral, that assumes other species will choose to develop comparable capabilities rather than simply avoiding targets capable of effective resistance. Elaborate. Galactic civilization has expanded for millennia by conquering worlds with inadequate defenses, Admiral. Species that encounter effective resistance typically redirect their expansion efforts toward easier targets rather than investing in the development of superior conquest capabilities. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. HFY knew that consortium expansion policy specifically prioritized low-resistance acquisitions over militarily challenging conquests. The economic logic was unassailable. Why invest resources in difficult campaigns when easier alternatives were available? But eventually, easy targets become scarce. Eventually, Admiral. But eventually operates on geological timescales for galactic civilization. Individual species and political entities make decisions based on immediate strategic concerns rather than theoretical future limitations. Does meaning no one will invest in countering human defensive capabilities because alternative expansion targets remain available. Meaning humanity has achieved practical immunity from conquest through the simple expedient of making conquest attempts unprofitable relative to available alternatives. The strategic elegance was breathtaking. Humanity had created conditions where attempting their conquest would require resource investments that exceeded any conceivable benefit, while alternative expansion targets remained readily available throughout the galaxy. Director Ashworth, this conversation has been educational. That was our objective, Admiral. We hope the intelligence you've gathered will prove useful in preventing future misunderstandings. One final question. Why share this information? You could have simply eliminated our fleet like the others. Because elimination creates mystery, Admiral, while education creates understanding. Mystery encourages continued investigation, while understanding promotes avoidance. You want galactic civilization to understand that Earth is too dangerous to attack. We want galactic civilization to understand that Earth doesn't require attacking, Admiral. We pose no threat to galactic expansion because we have no interest in participation. We offer no resources that cannot be obtained more efficiently elsewhere. We present no strategic advantages that justify the costs of acquisition. And if that situation changes, then galactic civilization will have comprehensive intelligence about our capabilities and strategic methodology, Admiral. Fair warning, if you will. HFY felt the conversation reaching its natural conclusion, but one aspect still troubled him. Director Ashworth, what happens to the personnel from previous expeditions? The survivors? What survivors, Admiral? From the destroyed fleets? Surely some individuals survived the destruction of their vessels. Ashworth's expression didn't change, but something in his manner suggested the question had touched on topics he preferred to avoid. Admiral, our defensive strategy focuses on neutralizing invasion capabilities rather than eliminating personnel. However, individuals who survive the destruction of their vessels face certain practical difficulties, such as the fact that their governments believe them dead, Admiral. Return to their home systems would require explanations that might compromise the intelligence arrangements we've established. You're holding prisoners? We're providing extended hospitality to individuals whose return home would create complications for all parties involved, Admiral. The euphemism was chilling, but Kethvar understood the logic. Survivors who return to report humanity's true capabilities would trigger exactly the kind of escalated response that both sides preferred to avoid. How many individuals are we discussing? Several hundred personnel from reconnaissance missions, Admiral, plus a handful of command staff from the major expeditions. They're quite comfortable, and several have made significant contributions to our understanding of galactic civilization. Contributions. Intelligence about galactic military doctrine, political structures, and expansion strategies, Admiral. Voluntary contributions, I should emphasize. We've found that explaining the strategic situation typically produces cooperative attitudes. Kethvar realized he was witnessing the other side of humanity's educational approach to defense. They didn't just study their enemies' tactical methods, they recruited their enemies' personnel to provide intelligence about galactic civilization. And if we choose to report this intelligence to the consortium, then the consortium will face the same decision your predecessors faced, Admiral. They can accept the reality of humanity's defensive capabilities and adjust their expansion strategies accordingly, or they can attempt to develop countermeasures that we've already anticipated and prepared to defeat. You've prepared for escalated response? Admiral, we've spent 73 years preparing for every conceivable galactic response to our defensive capabilities. Escalated response is simply one scenario among many, including consortium response, including the possibility that the consortium might attempt to organize a multi-species coalition against humanity, Admiral. We found that scenario sufficiently probable to justify specific preparations. The casual mention of preparations for multi-species coalition warfare made Kethvar reconsider everything he thought he understood about strategic planning. Humanity had apparently anticipated not just individual invasion attempts, but coordinated galactic response to their defensive success. What would such preparations involve? Nothing that would threaten galactic civilization, provided galactic civilization doesn't threaten us, Admiral. However, coalition warfare presents certain tactical opportunities that individual invasion attempts do not. Meaning, a coalition attack would provide us with comprehensive intelligence about multiple species' military capabilities simultaneously, Admiral. Such intelligence would be extremely valuable for long-term strategic planning. Kethvar felt a chill as he realized the implications. Humanity wasn't just prepared to defend against coalition attack, they were apparently hoping for it as an intelligence-gathering opportunity. Director Ashworth, are you encouraging coalition response? We're explaining the strategic realities, Admiral. Coalition response would be extremely educational for both sides, and extremely destructive. For the coalition, yes, Admiral. Our defensive capabilities scale more favorably than coalition offensive capabilities. How is that possible? Because coalition warfare requires coordination between species with different tactical doctrines, communication protocols, and strategic objectives, Admiral. Such coordination creates vulnerabilities that don't exist in individual invasion attempts, while your defensive systems are specifically designed for coordination. While our defensive systems have been optimized for exactly that scenario, Admiral, Kethvar realized the conversation had moved beyond intelligence sharing into strategic intimidation. The humans weren't just explaining their defensive capabilities, they were demonstrating their understanding of galactic strategic thinking to a degree that suggested comprehensive preparation for every conceivable threat scenario. Director Ashworth, I think this intelligence exchange has provided all the information my government requires. Excellent, Admiral. Safe travels. Udun, the casual dismissal carried undertones that made Kethvar profoundly uncomfortable. He was being sent home with intelligence that would fundamentally alter the consortium's approach to expansion, while humanity continued its mysterious preparations in complete isolation. Director, one truly final question. Of course, Admiral. What exactly are you preparing for? The inevitable moment when galactic civilization runs out of easy targets for expansion, Admiral. And then galactic civilization will need to decide whether to accept the limitations of available expansion opportunities or attempt to develop capabilities sufficient to overcome prepared defenses. What do you estimate they'll choose, Admiral? That depends on how effectively our current intelligence sharing prevents unnecessary conflicts in the near term. Education tends to delay violence, but it rarely prevents it permanently. And if violence becomes unavoidable, then galactic civilization will discover whether 73 years of preparation can match several millennia of expansion experience, Admiral. Who do you think will win? Admiral, victory in that scenario wouldn't involve winners. It would involve survivors. The statement carried implications that extended far beyond the current conversation. Kethvar realized he was talking to a representative of a species that had spent 7 decades preparing not just for invasion, but for galactic war. Director Ashworth, thank you for your cooperation. Thank you for your flexibility, Admiral. Please give our regards to the consortium leadership. The transmission ended, leaving Kethvar alone with intelligence that would reshape galactic strategic thinking and implications that stretched across centuries of potential conflict. His fleet began its journey home, carrying the most significant intelligence breakthrough in consortium history. 3 months later, Kethvar stood before the assembled Consortium Military Council, delivering a briefing that would fundamentally alter their civilization's approach to expansion and conquest. Gentlemen, we have encountered a species that represents a completely unprecedented strategic paradigm. They have achieved practical immunity from conquest through comprehensive defensive preparation, while maintaining complete isolation from galactic affairs. The council members listened with growing unease as he described humanity's capabilities, strategic methodology, and apparent preparations for escalated conflict. When he finished, the chamber remained silent for several long moments. Admiral Kethvar, what are your recommendations? Fleet Marshal Kexmore asked finally. Complete avoidance, sir. Humanity presents no expansion opportunities that justify engagement risks. They offer no strategic advantages that cannot be obtained more safely elsewhere. Most importantly, they appear to have prepared specifically for the scenarios that would result from our decision to engage. And if other species attempt invasion, then those species will provide humanity with additional intelligence about galactic military capabilities while eliminating themselves as potential threats, sir. Our optimal strategy is to observe from a safe distance, while other civilizations demonstrate the futility of aggressive engagement. You're recommending that we allow other species to attack humanity? I'm recommending that we avoid repeating their mistakes, sir. The Council voted unanimously to classify the Sol system as a restricted zone, prohibited to all consortium military operations. Similar restrictions were quietly implemented by every major galactic civilization that received copies of Kethvar's intelligence reports. Humanity continued its mysterious development in complete isolation, surrounded by a growing sphere of space that no military force dared to enter. Occasionally, young civilizations or ambitious warlords would attempt to test the restrictions, providing humanity with fresh intelligence about galactic development while reinforcing the galaxy's growing conviction that some worlds were better left alone. The pattern held for centuries, with humanity serving as a strange attractor that drew aggressive expeditions to their destruction while accumulating comprehensive intelligence about galactic civilizations' evolution. Each failed invasion attempt added to their understanding of galactic capabilities while reinforcing their reputation as an impossible target. Then, as Director Ashworth had predicted, galactic civilization began running out of easy expansion targets. The first multi-species coalition formed 300 years after Kethavar's return, comprising 17 civilizations that had exhausted their individual expansion opportunities and faced the choice between accepting strategic limitations or attempting to overcome the most successful defensive installation in galactic history. They chose escalation. The coalition assembled the largest military force in galactic history, over 2 million vessels representing the combined military might of species that individually commanded hundreds of star systems. Their combined technological capabilities exceeded anything previously seen in galactic warfare. They approached the Sol system confident that even humanity's vaunted defenses could not withstand the coordinated assault of 17 civilizations that had spent 3 centuries analyzing the failures of previous invasion attempts. Director Ashworth's great-great-grandson, Director Marcus Ashworth, greeted them with the same casual confidence his ancestor had displayed centuries earlier. The conversation was brief. Director Ashworth, this coalition represents the combined military might of 17 galactic civilizations. We demand humanity's immediate surrender and integration into galactic civilization. Gentlemen, we've been expecting you for quite some time. We appreciate your patience in allowing us to complete our preparations. Your preparations cannot possibly match our combined capabilities. Actually, gentlemen, our preparations were specifically designed to match your combined capabilities. We've had 3 centuries to analyze galactic civilization's development and plan accordingly. Impossible. No single world can match the military power of 17 star-spanning empires. You're absolutely correct, gentlemen. No single world can match such power. Then you admit defeat. Gentlemen, we admit that no single world can match the military power of 17 star-spanning empires. And humanity stopped being a single world approximately 200 years ago. The revelation triggered emergency scanning protocols that revealed the truth humanity had hidden for 2 centuries, while galactic civilization focused on easier expansion targets. The Sol system wasn't defended by a single planet anymore. It was defended by a civilization that had spread throughout their star system, while maintaining complete invisibility to external observation, building installations on every planet, moon, and asteroid, while developing technologies that made detection impossible from outside the system's boundaries. The coalition faced not a single defensive installation, but a distributed civilization that had spent 3 centuries preparing specifically for multi-species coalition warfare, while studying every aspect of galactic military development through the intelligence provided by previous invasion attempts. What followed wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was an educational demonstration of what happened when 17 civilizations that had developed their military doctrines for expansion warfare encountered a civilization that had developed specifically to defeat multi-species coalition attacks. The coalition's advantage in numbers became a liability when humanity's distributed defenses turned their coordination requirements into tactical vulnerabilities. Their advantage in individual vessel capability became meaningless when humanity's strategic methodology focused on exploiting differences in coalition tactical doctrines rather than matching their technological capabilities. The coalition lasted 6 hours against an enemy they had expected to defeat in minutes. Director Marcus Ashworth's final transmission to the surviving coalition commanders was brief. Gentlemen, we hope this demonstration has provided valuable insight into the strategic principles governing defensive warfare. Please convey our regards to your respective governments, along with our continued desire for peaceful isolation. Of the 2 million vessels that had approached the Sol system, fewer than 50,000 survived to deliver that message. Galactic civilization's response was immediate and unanimous. The Sol system was declared a permanent exclusion zone, forbidden to all military traffic under penalty of immediate destruction by any civilization capable of enforcing the restriction. Humanity returned to its mysterious development in absolute isolation, having demonstrated once and for all that some enemies were too dangerous to fight and too well prepared to surprise. The galaxy had learned its lesson, but the lesson itself was terrifying. Somewhere in the void around an unremarkable yellow star, a species that claimed no interest in expansion had developed capabilities that exceeded the combined military might of galactic civilization. They remained alone, not because they lacked the power to conquer, but because they lacked the interest in conquest. And that restraint was the most frightening thing of all.